resources with able-bodied adults who refuse to work. As one father recently wrote in the Wall Street Journal, Medicaid was created to help people like my son. He is 17, has severe autism and epilepsy, and needs constant attention. Yet thanks to Obamacare's Medicaid expansion, he is stuck on a multi-year waiting list for an in-home care because able-bodied adults are competing for the same results. CBO estimates that over 1.4 million illegal aliens are receiving Medicaid benefits. I'm talking about those who are not United States citizens and are not legally in the United States, receiving Medicaid benefits, and pushing those like this man's 17-year-old son out of his opportunity to get access to those benefits. Brett Guthrie, the chairman of the Energy and Commerce Committee in the House, correctly notes, every dollar misspent on illegal immigrants and ineligible individuals in the Medicaid program means less money going to our children, our pregnant women and mothers, individuals, and others who are disabled and seniors. Republicans are committed to preserving and strengthening Medicaid for the people Medicaid was intended to serve. That starts with making common sense reforms to eliminate waste, fraud, and abuse in the program. This bill targets rampant fraud in the program by removing illegal aliens, deceased recipients, or those enrolled in multiple states. It eliminates wasteful spending by ensuring that Medicaid payments align with levels in Medicare and other spending programs, and increases the frequency of eligibility checks. It requires more personal accountability and promotes pathways to work for able-bodied adults. The work requirements proposed in this legislation are simple. Many people are amazed that they're so easy to meet and yet so rigorously opposed. If you are an able-bodied adult without dependents, you can qualify for taxpayer-funded Medicaid by spending 20 hours per week working or participating in work training or going to school or participating in community service or volunteer work. The majority of Americans agree that these rules are responsible guardrails to protect a program that was designed to protect America's most vulnerable Americans. The bill also corrects abusive practices by freezing and reducing provider taxes, a financial gimmick used by states to increase federal spending that they receive. For those concerned about funding for rural hospitals during the transition back to responsible funding levels, the legislation creates a bridge funding system to help stabilize rural hospitals and enhance their long-term financial solvency. And while Democrats claim Republicans are slashing Medicaid spending, the reality is that even with these reforms, Medicaid spending is projected to continue to grow by billions of dollars over the next 10 years. Only in Washington is a smaller increase in spending considered a cut. In reality, these reforms will improve, protect, and preserve Medicaid for the most vulnerable Americans. We've had a very robust debate over how to best deliver on President Trump's agenda, and I'm proud of what we achieved in this legislation. The tax provisions in our bill, from permanent extension of the lower tax rate to the increased child tax credit to the permanent tax relief for businesses, will deliver financial security for American families and grow our economy. The health care provisions will protect and preserve Medicaid for the Americans that the program was designed to serve. And while more work remains, this bill's economic growth, combined with deficit reduction that we have in it, finally puts our country on a much better fiscal trajectory. Speaking of work, I would be remiss if I did not take a moment to thank the excellent staff from the Joint Committee on Taxation, the Congressional Budget Office, and the Senate Legislative Council for the hard work and countless hours they have put in to get us to this point. Some of them have been working with us on these provisions for years, and we greatly appreciate your partnership in this effort. I ask unanimous consent to have these individuals' names printed in the record. Thank you. I also have to thank my incredible staff who have foregone sleep over the past several months to provide timely, indispensable insight, facts, legislative text, counsel, and so much more. Without them, we would not be at this point and ready to deliver this much needed growth-focused policy for the American people. I ask unanimous consent to have the names of my entire Finance Committee staff printed in the record.
Without objection.
Thank you. Even with all that, and all that we accomplish in this legislation, there are dozens of additional good ideas, smart policies, and common sense reforms that we were not able to include today. And I commit to working with my colleagues to advance those goals as well as we move forward. But today's historic legislation is more than a good start and will pay dividends for American families, extending good tax policy, delivering targeted relief, and reining in wasteful spending, as achieved in this bill, is the best way to restore economic prosperity and opportunity for all Americans. I look forward to getting it to the President's desk as soon as possible. Thank you, Mr. President.
Mr. President.
I recognize it. Democrat Whip.
Mr. President, we're here today debating a clumsily assembled package, still a work in progress, that would rip away health care from 16 million American families to give tax breaks to millionaires, billionaires, and our largest corporations. Think about that for a moment. The Republicans have decided that the best avenue to generate revenue that they can then give in tax breaks to wealthy people is to eliminate health insurance coverage for 16 million Americans. That's going to have a dramatic impact on their lives. If you have ever been a young father with a baby with a serious medical problem and you had no health insurance, you'll never forget it as long as you live. I know, I've been there. The notion of losing your health insurance leaves you as vulnerable as possible in some of the most important moments of your life. And that they would consider this provision to eliminate health insurance coverage for 16 million families is unimaginable and cruel. Let's not act like there is a unified Republican front on this issue. Even some of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle don't want to be here at this moment, jamming this unpopular bill through this chamber under arbitrary deadlines. One of my colleagues took a look at tax breaks, and you're going to hear them say over and over again, well, the average family, if we don't act, the average family is going to have to pay more in taxes. There's a way around that. If we limit any tax breaks in this bill, in this effort, to people making $400,000 a year or less, $400,000 a year or less, it virtually eliminates 2/3 of the cost of this undertaking. And it means you don't have to take away the health insurance of 16 million families. So there are ways to do tax breaks which make sense. Count this Democrat in with the Republicans for helping working families who are struggling to get by, and a lot of them are, living paycheck to paycheck. And the notion that we would say to them, we're going to take away your health insurance, we're going to raise the cost of health insurance for you, is no answer to their problems. Behind closed doors, my Republican colleagues continue to be consumed with infighting, bickering over the bill's substance, and for good reason. We have a process here which is almost impossible to explain to an ordinary person of how we reach reconciliation. The parliamentarian's office, and she's sitting here, God bless you for what you've been through for the last several months, and all your staff, have to make decisions on a daily basis over and over again as to whether or not provisions of this bill are eligible under the law that governs the United States Senate. We're in the process of debating this on the Senate floor. I see our ranking member on the Budget Committee, Senate Budget Committee, the senator from Oregon. We're in the process of still appealing to the parliamentarian's office on provisions in the bill. This is truly a work in progress. I think what they do know is troubling, and it should be. This bill would be a disaster for hospitals. The Senate Republican bill, unfortunately, is going to endanger hospitals all over the United States. But if you happen to live in a small town, rural area, and I represent a lot of them in the state of Illinois, you're the most vulnerable. You are the target. When they cut back on Medicaid programs, these are the hospitals that will close their doors. What's the impact of a hospital closing its door in a downstate community in Illinois? Devastating. Hospitals are not only the center for emergency medical care, good doctors, nurses, and such, they are also a major economic force in small-town America. Take away a hospital and then try to attract a new business to your community. Good luck. This Senate bill cripples one of the main ways that states fund their Medicaid programs and keep hospitals afloat, especially rural and low-income areas. It's called the provider tax. Earlier this week, a Republican senator, circulated a flyer to his fellow caucus members, so they're all on notice, detailing just how much each state will lose in Medicaid provider tax funding under their proposal. Let's take a look at my neck of the woods, the Midwest. Iowa would lose $4.1 billion. Missouri, $6.1 billion. Kentucky, $12 billion. Louisiana would lose $20 billion. North Carolina, $38.9 billion. Senator Tillis and I were in conversation yesterday, and he used that very same figure. His analysis says that to go forward with this bill cuts Medicaid reimbursement in his home state of North Carolina by a whopping $38.9 billion. This list of states and what they will lose was passed around by a Republican senator to his own caucus. They know what they're up against here. If Republicans have their way and pass this bill, hospitals will be forced to shrink or eliminate services. In Decatur, Illinois, one of the major hospitals facing the crunch time had to make a decision whether they keep their doors open. They did, but they eliminated OBGYN, delivering babies, and they eliminated all mental health and addiction counseling, two critical areas for the hospitals. So these doctors, this bill will force hospitals to shrink or eliminate services. Doctors and nurses will leave, and in some cases, the hospital will close. Imagine that in a rural area, a remote area, an extra 45 minutes, an extra hour in the car with somebody in the front seat you love very much who's in a desperate situation. As it stands today, half of the rural hospitals around the country already operate in a danger zone. And it's the same thing for children's hospitals. Do you have one in your community that you've used? I do. These children's hospitals have warned us they can't keep their doors open if Medicaid is cut as dramatically as the Republicans want to cut it. If Republicans have their way, we're going to see massive layoffs, fewer nurses, technicians, and doctors, along with decreasing quality of care. The American Hospital Association has estimated how these cuts to Medicaid could impact not just jobs at red state hospitals, but across the entire economy. Here's what they found. If the Republican provision goes through that cuts Medicaid reimbursement in order to provide tax breaks for wealthy people, Maine, as an example, one state, would lose 5,000 jobs. Kansas, 6,200 jobs. Iowa, 11,000 jobs. Missouri, 26,600 jobs. I've talked to the administrator of BJC in St. Louis, Missouri. The reason is it's not just a Missouri hospital. They have their facilities on the Illinois side of the river. In fact, 1/3 of their patients are from Illinois, and 1/3 of the patients overall use Medicaid to go to their hospital. So he's told me what's going to happen if the Republican measure goes through and the cutbacks to these hospitals. They came up with, incidentally, the rescue fund to solve the political problem. I want to check to make sure Senator Murray can back me up on this. Our overall cut in Medicaid now is at about $1 trillion. Correct. $1 trillion. Imagine, this is Washington, we talk in those terms. Cutting Medicaid nationwide $1 trillion. And the rescue plan for the small hospitals that are in danger, the ones I've talked about, $1 trillion cut. How big's the rescue plan? $25 billion. Do the math. It's a joke. It is a joke. If Republican leaders think this is an adequate amount to alleviate pain all of our nation's rural hospitals are going to feel, then that's like trying to put out a forest fire with a garden hose. This simply won't work. I want to conclude by saying this. We passed the Affordable Care Act 15 years ago. Of all the things that I've worked on in Congress, I think it had more positive impact to help the families across America than anything. We found a way to make health insurance more affordable for families 15 years ago. And to do it, we held hearings. 100 hearings on the Affordable Care Act. Obamacare is what they called it. Roundtables, walkthroughs. 2 committees spent a combined 21 days holding markups so that everyone could offer an amendment. Do you know how many amendments were made to the Obamacare program? 400. 400 votes in committee and on the floor on amendments. 147 Republican amendments were included, though not a single Republican senator ended up supporting Obamacare when it was all over. What do we have here with this measure? At the end of the day, that legislation, the Obamacare, allowed more than 40 million Americans to gain health insurance. Today, how many hearings have we had on the bill that's before us, this dramatic multi-trillion-dollar bill? None. Zero. Not a single one. Zero markups for senators to offer amendments. 400 amendments on Obamacare. None on this one until it comes to the floor today. Zero bipartisan input. Our friends on the Republican side have said basically, it's a big deal. Take it or leave it. Should this bill become law, do you know what we've done? Thrown 16 million Americans off health insurance and closed many vulnerable small hospitals, all to pay for tax breaks for millionaires and billionaires. Maybe some of my Republicans are okay with that. I don't think the American people are. I'm hoping that sanity and common sense prevail. We need 4. We need 4 senators to step up and say, stop this train. We've got to sit down and do our homework. We cannot expose the American families and the American economy to do this in the name of preserving tax breaks for the wealthiest people. Elon Musk seems to be doing okay in life, right? The wealthiest man in the world. Do you know what the tax break is for Elon Musk on the bill that's before us on the floor? $346,000, a lot of money. To him, he won't even notice it. Giving him a tax break, he won't notice, and taking away health insurance from families who will be devastated, 16 million around the country. It's an important choice, and it's one we should make the right one. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
I recognize the senator from Kentucky.
In deciding whether to vote for the big, not-so-beautiful bill, I've asked a very specific question. Will the deficit be more or less next year? The answer, without question, is this bill will grow the deficit. The federal government has fancy formulas and hundreds of wonky accountants who inform us of their projections over 10 years. But you often can't trust these projections. In an excellent piece written by the Foundation for Economics and Education entitled "The CBO's Projections Are Worse Than Useless," Eric Schuler writes, "Long-term analysis and language is commonplace in U.S. national politics, but it achieves no useful outcome. It confuses far more than it clarifies. It does not provide accurate estimates of long-term results. It does not improve the average voter's understanding of policy effects. And it gives politicians a means to claim they are being fiscally responsible without actually ever exercising any prudence whatsoever." Sometimes the predictions are off because a new Congress is elected and changes the law. Eric Schuler writes that for any projection of a 10-year budget to be accurate, the Congressional Budget Office has to assume that the law won't change for 10 years, even as most of the politicians that make the laws risk being replaced every 2 years, and all of them advocate for changes of one stripe or another. Schuler states that few in Washington will admit Congress has a knack for starting any proposed cuts in the later years, while letting spending run wild in the immediate future. Sometimes these predictions are off by $1 trillion or so because the economy grew more slowly or more quickly than anticipated. Bruce Thompson, a former Senate aide and Assistant Secretary of Treasury, writes, "The Congressional Budget Office miscalculated the deficit last year by $1 trillion. So in deciding whether to vote for any big, monstrous bill, it helps to ask the right question. To me, the most pertinent question is, how will the bill affect the deficit in the next year? Currently, our deficit is estimated to be a little under $2 trillion this year. What will happen to the debt in 2026 if this bill passes? Well, using the math most favorable to the supporters of the bill, referred to as the policy baseline, the deficit in 2026 will still be $270 billion more than this year. So even using the math, even using the formulas that the supporters of the bill like, the deficit will grow by $270 billion next year. That's just not good if you profess to be fiscally conservative. Why will the deficit grow next year? Well, even if you argue that the 2017 tax cuts don't need to be counted in the calculation at all, the new tax cuts add up to $234 billion to the debt next year. In addition, the big not-so-beautiful bill adds new spending of over $500 billion, military, border, agricultural subsidies, etc. That spending is front-loaded and will be spent in the first 4 years of the 10-year window. Legislated spending is one of the few items in the bill that is exact. It isn't estimated. If they say they'll spend $500 billion, they're going to spend $500 billion, all in the first few years. So in order not to add to the deficit, the BBB, the big not-so-beautiful bill, has to have corresponding spending cuts to counter all the new spending. Unfortunately, the spending cuts are backloaded to the final 5 years of the 10-year window when several tax cuts expire and the spending increases are finished. In addition, elections occur every 2 years and could easily wipe out any perceived savings that might occur in the later years. The only real certainty in this budget drama are the budget years coming in the immediate future. It's the next year or two are the only things that are actually of any certainty. So if we analyze this bill from that perspective, we discover that the bill increases the debt by $500 billion in the first 5 years. This is not the CBO projection that Republicans have not liked. This is the projection they are using, says the debt will add $500 billion in the first 5 years. Now, they say somehow, miraculously, in the last 5 years, it gets to a $500 billion in savings. So it's $1 trillion shift from year 5 to year 10. The CBO scores it differently, not as encouraging, and says it adds over $3 trillion in debt. So which is it? Does this bill save $500 billion over 10, or does it add $3 trillion over 10? The truth is that even a person with a magic crystal ball, it's anybody's guess. Which brings us back to, maybe we have to judge the effects of the big, not-so-beautiful bill by looking at what happens to the debt next year. Supporters of the bill admit it adds $270 billion to the debt next year. That's the only thing we know for certain. We don't know what happens in year 3, 4, 7, 8, 9, 10, but we know next year this bill will grow the deficit by $270 billion. In addition, the bill increases the debt ceiling by $5 trillion. What does that mean? That is an admission that they know they aren't controlling the deficit. They know that the ensuing years will add trillions more. So we're adding $2 trillion this year, but they're anticipating, the authors of the bill anticipating adding more than $2 trillion next year. That doesn't sound at all conservative to me, and that's why I'm a no.
Mr. President.
I recognize the senator from Oregon.
Mr. President, joining me on the floor are experts in the budget process, former chairs and ranking members, Senator Murray, who's been Senate Budget Chair from 2013 to 15, Senator Whitehouse, who's Senate Budget Chair 2023 through 2025, Senator Van Hollen, who was the ranking Democrat on the House Budget Committee in 2011 through 2017. We're here to address a fundamental violation of the law, of Law 313, Section 313, and it is the set of rules for reconciliation. To try to summarize this in the simplest words possible, 100 senators voted to have a special fast-track, filibuster-free pathway solely for reducing the debt. First principle was no deficits could be created in a 10-year period. My Republican colleagues blew that up in 1996 when they wanted to do a tax bill that would create massive deficits. Then, a second pillar was no deficits in any title of the bill in any year after the first 10 years. This bill right now, if this passes, that blows that up. And the third was use honest numbers, Congressional Budget Office numbers. I have a letter here from the Congressional Budget Office, and they say, the estimate is relative to CBO's January 2025 baseline. CBO is required to construct its baseline under the assumptions specified in the Balanced Budget and Emergency Deficit Control Act and the Congressional Budget and Impoundment Act. In response to your questions about the cost of Title VII, the question was, would Title VII increase the deficit by more than the $1.5 trillion over the 2025 through 34 period? The answer is yes. CBO estimates that enacting would increase the deficit by nearly $3.5 trillion over the 2025-2034 period, $3.5 trillion. We then asked, would it increase deficits in the years beyond 2034, beyond the 10-year window? The answer was yes. But if you ask my Republican friends, they say, no, no, no. We're inventing a new theory, and that is that anything that the 2017 tax giveaway to the billionaires put into the law that expired after 10 years, we're just going to assume it would have continued, and therefore, us continuing it doesn't cost anything. That's a pretty crazy notion, that if they didn't put it into the bill, the law says it ends, but they say, no, no, it would have continued anyway through some magical way. So therefore, a tax break for the really wealthy costs nothing. This is exactly the type of lying to ourselves, smoke and mirrors that 100 senators agreed to end back in 1974. And that it has continued, that piece of it has continued in place for 51 years until this moment in this Senate by this Republican majority says we're going to start lying to ourselves and lying to the American people about what this bill costs. But we're not going to lie, we're going to tell you the truth. This bill costs well over $3 trillion over 10 years and some $30+ trillion on top of existing deficits and debt because of the provisions that are in this particular bill. Our current debt, national debt, that's been run up since the Declaration of Independence is around $36.5 trillion. This bill basically matches that in creating that much additional debt over the next 30 years. This is a huge assault on the programs that we can sustain as a nation for the people of America. People struggling to get on their feet, so we want affordable housing programs. We want to have fair and quality health care. We want to have an education system that gives every child the opportunity to thrive. We want to create a robust economy through investment so there are good jobs because no government program is better than a good job. All those imperiled by this bill because the Republican leadership is lying to the American people and lying to ourselves. So we're here to tell the truth, and first of all, we're going to turn to Senator Murray, who, as I mentioned, was the Senate Budget Chair from 2013 to 2015.
Mr. President.
I recognize the senator from Washington State.
I thank the senator from Oregon and our other budget chairs, ranking members from previous years, because this is really important. Mr. President, there are some things you can't change with legislation, despite what my colleagues on the other side of the aisle seem to believe. For example, 1 + 1 is 2. And while $1 trillion might have a lot of zeros in it, it is, in fact, a much, much bigger number. Now, that might sound obvious, but apparently my colleagues across the aisle need a little reminder, because right now, Republicans are pretending not to get it. It is almost beyond belief, and it is certainly beyond common sense. After years of complaining about the debt, in fact, at the same time they're talking about how we need to address the debt, Republicans now are suddenly pretending they don't know how to count. Republicans are suddenly pretending the parliamentarian doesn't exist if they don't talk to her. Republicans are suddenly pretending that precedent doesn't exist if they just fake amnesia, and that norms and consequences for breaking them will disappear if they wish it away really hard. My preschool students had more common sense. Republicans should know if they replace math with magic, if they tear up the Senate process, if they blow off the Senate parliamentarian, that bill will come due. And not just the bill for $4 trillion blown on tax cuts for billionaires and corporations. The bill will also come due for trashing this Senate process and precedent when Republicans are no longer in the majority. Mr. President, if Republicans are serious about plowing forward with rewriting or ignoring Senate procedure and the laws of mathematics, I just ask, spare me the empty excuses. Spare me the explanations that totally ignore the reality of what you are doing. I mean, do they really think it washes away everything to say, oh, it's fine to break the process in half because we say it's fine? Oh, it's fine. We have the authority to ignore math. Give me a break. To every Republican who really thinks that is a convincing argument, to anyone who thinks we can is just an acceptable rationale for going nuclear and pretending the most expensive bill in the history of our country can be paid for by some magic bean counting, here is my challenge to you. Go back home and try that game with your constituents. Tell them, it's okay, yes, the debt's going to be $4 trillion, higher 10 years from now. That's true. But it's fine. We voted on it. And we get to say $1 trillion is actually 0. Go ahead. See how that works for you. And you may as well tell them you are voting against gravity next, because that's just as reasonable. And don't forget, when you tell your families back home that trillions of dollars in tax cuts for billionaires and companies are free because you waved a wand or you said some magic words, don't forget to tell them those are just tax cuts for the billionaires, not for working families. Don't forget to tell the folks back home, yeah, I voted to say $1 trillion is nothing, but we still need to kick people off of their health care. That's just too expensive. We still need to close those hospitals. We have to cut costs, and we still have to kick people off SNAP because the debt is out of control. And don't forget to mention that, no, we can't afford childcare. We can't afford paid family leave. We can't afford to solve your problems. Magic math is apparently just for billionaires. You all are getting less. Please, Republicans, send that message to your constituents. Just see how it goes over. Because you can fool yourself, but you are not going to fool the American people. They don't get to balance their budget with magic math. They don't get to pretend $1 trillion is nothing. And they don't get to pretend that this bill is free. Because at the end of the day, regardless of what policy baseline you all want to use in DC, those families back home, they're the ones who will be paying the actual cost. I yield back to the senator from Oregon.
Yield to a question.
I would.
In the time that you were budget chair, did you ever contemplate a situation in which you argued that renewing a tax break that was by law expiring would somehow have no impact on the deficit?
To my friend from Oregon, I never would have contemplated and I never would have put it forward. And I happen to know that if I had have suggested that my Republican colleagues would have been all over me telling me that breaks the rules.
Thank you very much. We're turning to Senator Whitehouse, who was Senate Budget Chair from 2023 to 2025.
Thank you, Senator Merkley. I mentioned earlier the history of the section that the Republican budget chairman is using to perform this multi-trillion-dollar magical act of making huge deficit-busting numbers disappear. It's called Section 312. It has been used before, but it has always been minor, corrective, and bipartisan. I mentioned earlier the adjustment that was made on a bipartisan basis to the Power Marketing Administration's numbers to return the CBO to an agreement that the Senate had previously made. That was not enormously consequential. This is almost certainly the first time you're hearing about it. Again, in 2023, as budget chair with Republican Chair Jody Arrington on the House side, we made a $105 million adjustment to a dairy program. Today we're talking about trillions. This was a $105 million adjustment. Again, bipartisan, minor, and corrective, fixing a technical issue on a bipartisan basis. Last year, Speaker Johnson and Leader Schumer agreed to direct CBO to score a fee program with an OMB estimate, and they used this rule again, collaborating on a bipartisan basis with a matter that was minor and corrective. Well, this is different. This is trillions. And Republicans are using this rule to pretend that it's not. Well, there are lots of ways to look at who's right. Time obviously will tell. But this bill actually has a tell right in it. Page 754 of this bill is the reality check on whether or not they're running up the debt by trillions. We know they're running up the debt by trillions because they say so in this bill. You can play Senate procedural fakery. You can wave magic wands around numbers all day long, but someday, soon, you hit reality. And you hit reality in the real world of markets and selling treasury bonds and having a legal debt limit. If this did not raise the debt by trillions, they would not need to raise the debt limit by trillions. Here is the text. Subtitle C, increase in debt limit. Section 72001, modification of limitation on the public debt. The limitation under Section 3101B of Title 31 is increased by $5 trillion. They're dodging the parliamentarians' ruling by letting the budget chair make a $1 trillion magic wand maneuver because they know pretty darn well what the parliamentarians' ruling would be. And how do they know what the parliamentarians' ruling would be? Because the answer's in their own damn bill. I yield the floor.
Would the senator from Rhode Island yield for a question?
Of course.
You mentioned the use of Section 312, which gives some flexibility to resolve, as you put it, minor issues on a bipartisan basis to correct an issue, a technical issue. In those cases you mentioned, were those on a reconciliation bill?
Were they on a reconciliation bill? I don't believe they were.
No, they were not.
They were
In fact,
just...
that power has never been used on a reconciliation bill because the following Section 313 gives very specific instructions. It says each provision must be costed out for its impact on both outlays, the spending side, or revenue, should it be a revenue measure. And if you were saying well, how do I do that? You say, well, if we pass this provision, what will it cost as compared to not passing this provision, not having the bill? That's a comparison to current law. This ability of the budget chair, and actually the law says the budget committee, to correct technical issues on narrow issues on a bipartisan base, basically solve snarly little budgeting questions, like on the dairy program you mentioned, never used on reconciliation ever, never used on a broad basis ever, never used to create a lie about what a bill costs in this fashion. Now we're turning to Senator from Maryland, who was ranking Democrat on the House Budget Committee for 6 years. So he brings a lot of experience and knowledge about the budget process. Senator Van Hollen.
Well, Mr. President, I thank my colleague and the ranking member of the Senate Budget Committee, Senator Merkley. I just want to start by reading a statement. This is a quote. Anyone that says current policy baseline is the right way to go is engaging in intellectual and economic fraud. It's intellectually lazy. My basic mission in life is just to try to create some honest math, unquote. That wasn't from Senator Van Hollen or anyone on this floor. This was from a Republican member of the House, Congressman Schweikert from Arizona, talking about exactly the issue we're debating here in the United States Senate. Let me read you another quote, a little more colorful. Again, about this Republican accounting fraud. Quote, this is fairy dust, and they're just full of crap, and I'm going to call them out on it. Republican Congressman Chip Roy of Texas. They're right. This is a fraud. This is a fraud that would make the Enron scammers blush. And I quote those House members for a reason, because we can disagree with what they did in their bill, and I strongly disagree with it. But at least they used honest math, and at least they used the math that is required by the rules here in the Senate. The honest math that Republicans here in the Senate want to dodge, because it will both tell the American people just how big the deficits are, but also because it will screw up their whole entire plan. Just so people listening have some sense of how these Senate numbers are designed to disguise the real impact of their deficits. Look at, for example, the basic individual tax rates in the House bill. When they extended those tax rates from the Trump 2017 bill, it costs $2.2 trillion. Under what we call the current law baseline, which is the reality baseline, because that's what it will cost when you understand that they sunset at the end of this year, and that's what it will cost to renew them. So under honest accounting, it's $2.2 trillion. Under the Senate fraudulent accounting, that $2.2 trillion deficit miraculously becomes an $83 billion deficit. Let's look at the House permanent extension of key deductions for businesses. That would cost honest accounting $821 billion. Under the Senate accounting scam, $6 billion. So what we're seeing here is this blatant, deliberate effort to mislead the American people about the true costs of this bill, about the deficit impacts of this bill, about how it will impact the debt. And we all know that when the debt goes up and we have to put more of our costs on Uncle Sam's credit card, it puts upward pressure on interest rates. That means Americans will pay higher interest rates on their mortgages, on their car loans, and everything else. So when you try to hide the deficit impact, you really are trying to fool the American people, and we're here to blow the whistle. Now, I just want to show our colleagues something that was put together by the Committee for a Responsible Budget. And if you look at the blue, you can see for each year, starting this year, 2025, 2006, the blue is what Senate Republicans claim their bill will add to the deficit. The red is how much more it will actually add to the deficit. So at the end of this 10-year period, what you see is Senate Republicans are claiming that their bill will add $441 billion, which is still a big number, but the real number when you do honest accounting, when you add up all of these, it's $4.2 trillion, a much bigger number. Now, I do want to point something out on this chart. I think everybody watching should understand it. If you look at these orange parts, these are the additional deficits from tax cuts. Starting here in year 2029, 2030, you'll see that they actually do start going down. Why is that? It's because the tax cut that President Trump promised for no tax on tips, they phased those out. This is all just a make-believe ruse. Yeah, we start providing no tax on tips, but those disappear. The tax breaks for wealthy people, they go on, and they go on not just for this 10-year period, but the reason they violate all the rules of reconciliation is because they keep going on after that. And as Senator Merkley said, if you look at the entire history of the Byrd rule, that's Senator Byrd, it was designed to make sure that 51 senators through a vote could not make these kind of permanent changes in any area, but specifically they were worried about areas that increased the national deficit and debt. So what Republican senators are doing is not only misleading the American people, but they're violating the entire structure that carved out this special procedure that we call reconciliation for the budget, which was intended to lower deficits and debts, not have them go on forever. As Senator Merkley has pointed out, I think if you look over a 30-year period, we're talking about $35 trillion plus additional to the debt. And Republicans want to hide that from the American people. That is budget fraud, pure and simple, and it is a violation of the rules of the United States Senate. This whole special structure that was created not to blow bigger holes in the debt and deficits, but to actually try to constrain them. So shame on everybody who's part of this fraud on the American people. I yield back my time.
Would the senator from Maryland yield for a question?
I will.
I found it very interesting that you pointed out that these tax provisions for the middle class, no tax on tips, is phased out, and no tax on overtime is phased out. And what you're saying, I believe, is that when they put into this bill that a tax break is ending, they're saying that it doesn't cost any more in the following years.
So they are certainly saying that their current policy baseline that they want us to make believe about would say that this wouldn't cost them. In other words, if they extended this, it wouldn't cost anything. It is interesting to note, not only does that expose the fraud behind the current policy baseline, but they made a very deliberate choice. Even though they now say that they can make these tax cuts permanent and still comply with the rules, they decided to make the tax cuts for very rich people permanent. But even though they say it's not going to cost anything anymore to provide, tax cuts with no tax on tips, they're phasing those out. And all of these areas are where President Trump made promises that he was going to take care of some working people. Well, man, those go away fast. Tax cuts for the rich, they go on for not just the full 10 years, but they keep going, which is why this is a violation of the entire reconciliation process.
So I find two things very interesting. They're saying if something was in the law that they passed in 2017 and it expires, they're pretending it doesn't expire and therefore extending doesn't cost anything. But in their own bill, when they say a provision expires, they say, no, it really does die, and therefore we're saving money in the years after. How is those two things possibly consistent?
Well, clearly they're not. I mean, this is literally magical thinking. This is why Republican Congressman Schweihart called this, or Chip Roy called this fairy dust, and why the congressman from Arizona said this was pure intellectual and economic fraud. That's what it is. That's the bottom line.
Well, I really thank the senator from Maryland also pointing out that President Trump, he did, when he was campaigning, say he was fighting for ordinary families. But at his inauguration, who did he have standing behind him? Not champions for health care or champions for housing, certainly not champions for nutrition or education, but in fact a series of like 5 or 6 billionaires. And now you're telling me that in this bill, and I want to make sure the American people understand this, the provisions that were sweeteners to say we were helping working people are being phased out, but they're keeping all the tax breaks for billionaires.
Well, you're right. You know, it was right down this hall, actually, that President Trump was sworn in, and he said it was going to be a new golden age for working people. Well, as you're pointing out, and this chart clearly shows, and their own budget reveals, it's clearly a golden age for billionaires and people who make a lot of money. And in this bill, they make sure that that golden age for very rich people goes on forever. They had a few little crumbs that they were throwing for a little while, we can see, to others, but just for a little while and just small amounts compared to the golden age for the billionaires.
Well, I must say my impression is, and I hope you'll correct me if I'm wrong, is that the Republicans are embarrassed by the fact that they're proposing a bill that creates over $3 trillion in debt in 10 years and over $30 trillion over 30 years, and that the vast bulk of it goes to billionaires. And so they want to say, we're so embarrassed because we mentioned fiscal responsibility when we were running for office. We were going to get the budget under control, and they're doing the opposite. And they're embarrassed that they're doing these cuts in programs to fund tax breaks for billionaires, cutting regular health care, 16 million people losing health care for tax breaks for billionaires that, as you point out, go on and on and on, actually permanent. I would certainly love to yield to my colleague from Rhode Island.
When I was budget chairman, and we were trying to focus, for instance, on the impending economic nightmare coming our way through climate-caused property insurance failures, what I would get is nonstop regular lectures from Republicans on the Budget Committee about how we had to take responsibility for the deficit, we had to reduce the debt, nothing else mattered as much, it was absolutely vital. And now, of course, we see that at their very first shot, with the power to do anything through their majority and using reconciliation, they're raising the debt. They're raising the deficit, and not by little, but by trillions. And I'm wondering if in your time as chairman, or perhaps in Senator Murray's time on the committee, or perhaps in Senator Van Hollen's time over on the House committee, you were favored with such constant lecturing by Republicans about the debt and the deficit, and how credible that all seems right now.
I'll yield to Senator Murray.
I thank the senator for his question, because it's just stunning to me that the vast majority of debate, in fact, all the debate that came from Republicans at the time I was chair of the Budget Committee trying to put forward a smart budget for the United States of America, the only thing they talked about was debt and deficit. The only challenge they made to us was debt and deficit. The only time we tried to do anything for childcare, for healthcare, they threw the debt at us. So it is pretty stunning to me that now that they need to raise the debt for giving tax breaks to the very rich people who stood behind the president at his inauguration, then they play with the numbers and pretend it's not real, and a trillion all of a sudden becomes zero, and I'm using some rule you've never heard of to try and pretend that this isn't real. It's fairy dust.
want to say, to answer the question from the senator from Rhode Island and pick up on what my colleagues have said, that when I was the senior Democrat, the ranking member on the House Budget Committee, Paul Ryan was the chairman of the committee. And look, we disagreed on many things. We agreed on many things. We both agreed that we should get our deficits and debt under control. We had different ideas on how to do it. He wanted to privatize Medicare. We wanted to close tax breaks for the rich. But we wanted to close tax breaks for the rich. But the reality is that the holy grail, I mean, the only guiding North Star for Republicans at that time was we've got to bring down deficits and debt. This is not that Republican Party, not in any way, shape, or form. They clearly don't give a damn. In fact, they are worried, as we can see, that the American people still care, which is why they want to engage in this fraudulent scheme. But I'll just close on this. I remember one of those years, I believe it was the 2012 Republican convention. They even put up a debt clock. They put up a debt clock at the convention.
I can't find it.
Right? I'm looking under my desk for the debt clock here because Republicans seem to have hidden it away forever. They want to wish it away. That's what they're telling us.
But the bill actually is required to raise the debt limit by $5 trillion. So in reality, there's a huge hit to our debt, huge additions to our deficit, and it makes me a little bit frustrated to think back to all those lectures that I had to receive as budget chairman, which the senator from Maryland witnessed as a longtime member of the Senate Budget Committee, which the ranking member witnessed in his time on the Budget Committee, and which Senator Murray experienced when she chaired the Budget Committee. We have been lectured to death by our colleagues, and at the very first instance when they had the power to do something about it, they went 180 the other direction and are cranking the national debt in order to give big benefits to the rich people who fund their campaigns.
For a question, and I know we need to move on here. I just want to add one thing. It's not just that it's going to be debt. It's the cost to families because this debt they are putting in place. I would ask the chair of the Budget Committee now, as he knows as I do, people's houses are going to cost more because their mortgage interest rates are going to go up. Their cars' interest rates are going to go up. This is not just magic numbers sitting out there pretending they're not big. Real families are going to feel the cost of this debt and this deficit.
I really appreciate that point from my colleague from Washington State, because in this bill, it creates so much necessitated borrowing that CBO estimates that that borrowing will cause interest rates to go up. And when interest rates go up for the Treasury, it goes up on your car loan, on your adjustable rate, a mortgage on your house, and just in general. These are costs that are borne by ordinary families. And I find it very interesting because the Republicans were demanding what they called the dynamic score, saying, well, won't these cuts produce such a great economy that it will kind of lift all boats and produce more revenue, and maybe the deficit won't be as bad. Here's what Congressional Budget Office found. Again, that's the nonpartisan, honest broker numbers. They found that because of the interest rates rising as a result of this massive sea of red ink that necessitates massive borrowing, that in fact those rising interest rates will hurt the economy. So there's no dynamic score that produces, oh, well, it isn't so bad after all. No, it's the opposite. And in fact, that dynamic argument has always been wrong. And we are looking at the folks who lectured, my colleague from Rhode Island, and I sat through many of those lectures as well. And I went, in my head, wait a minute, aren't these folks who did the massive ocean of red ink in the 2001 Bush tax bill? Aren't these the same folks that produced a massive ocean of ink in another tax bill 2 years later? Aren't the same ones that in 2017 did a massive ocean of red ink, and now they're doing it again? How could they possibly be putting themselves forward as deficit hawks or debt hawks? Not to mention that they cheered on two adventures that were a huge tragedy for the United States of America, trying to occupy Afghanistan and going to war in Iraq, which together added $8 trillion to our debt. And if you take a look at this chart, every time there is a Republican administration, the last deficit while they're in office compared to their first deficit goes up. For Clinton, it went down. That's fiscal responsibility. For George W. Bush, first term, it went up. For Obama, it went down. In other words, the Democratic presidents, time after time after time, Clinton, Obama, Biden, they reduced the deficits while they were in office. And the Republican presidents, while they were in office, every single time increased the deficits. So none of us want to hear any more talk about fiscal responsibility from across the aisle. You want to be fiscally responsible? Vote no on this bill, because this bill takes and fires 16 million people off of health care to finance those tax breaks for billionaires. This bill says 4 million children will go hungry to finance tax breaks for billionaires. This bill is families lose and billionaires win, and the debt goes up, endangering our ability to do basic programs for the entire next generation. It is wrong on every count. And I think collectively, we urge our colleagues to honor the argument they've made over time that, in fact, they were concerned about the deficit. They were concerned about American families. Because if you are concerned about the deficit and debt, if you are concerned about families, you must vote no on this bill. Thank you, Mr. President.
Senator from Washington.
Mr. President, I really want to thank my colleagues. I mean, you just said they used to call themselves deficit hawks. We need to call them deficit robins. They're robbing from you to pay for the billionaires. They are no longer deficit hawks. Agreed? Thank you.
My colleagues, and I think as Senator Merkley said, if you care about deficit and debt and you don't want working families to have to pay for these tax cuts for billionaires and the rich, vote no on the bill.
I'd only add in my last words, watch. Everybody watch as this goes forward, because we will give the Republicans a chance to reduce the increase to the debt and the deficit by peeling back just the tax cuts for the greedy billionaires. We would be voting for working class tax cuts, I'm almost certain. We'll have a chance to bring into stark focus through our amendments what really matters to the folks on the other side of the aisle, and that is the tax cuts for the super wealthy, for the billionaires, for the corporations that are offshoring jobs, and for the biggest polluters in the country. That's where their sweet spot is, and we will expose that through these votes.
Those votes, we're not sure when they will start, because the Republicans are redrafting provisions of this bill right now. That's how little time this Senate will have to actually know what's in this 1,000-page bill with all kinds of special deals tucked into it for various members. We will have little time to see because they're still writing it. So those amendments that my colleague from Rhode Island mentioned, stay tuned. We're not sure if those amendments are going to start at 2 in the morning or if they'll start sometime later tomorrow, but stay tuned and pay attention, because you're going to find out who stands with families and who stands to hurt families in favor of helping billionaires. Thank you.
Senator from Washington.
Mr. President, thank you. I think it's really important, the discussion we had right now about the deficit and debt, but I want to talk a little bit more about this bill in general. You know, recent KFF polling shows that this Republican big, ugly betrayal bill is overwhelmingly unpopular. In fact, this thing is more underwater than the Titanic. Nearly 2 in 3 Americans view this bill unfavorably. That goes up to nearly 3 in 4 when they learn it will kick millions off their health insurance. And it goes up to nearly 4 in 5 when they learn it will choke off funding to their local hospital. In other words, the more the American people hear about what is actually in this big, ugly betrayal bill, the more they dislike it. So with that in mind, I want to be here today to say a little bit more about what is in the Republicans' latest version. Spoiler alert, it is still big, it is still ugly, and it is an absolute betrayal of the people who sent us here to fight for them. The Republican plan is still going to mean over 16 million people losing health care as patients get kicked off their ACA plans. Kids and struggling families will get kicked off Medicaid. Rural hospitals are going to be forced to shut their doors. The Republican plan is still going to mean more starving families. New red tape is going to cut people off from their SNAP benefits that they need to put food on the table. And it is going to take away kids' school meals. The Republican plan still rips away support from the people in this country who are struggling the most to give away billions in tax breaks to billionaires who need help the least. In short, this latest version of Republicans' bill would still be one of the biggest transfers of wealth from the people at the bottom to the people at the top in our nation's history. When it comes to health care, this Republican abomination will cause millions of people to lose their insurance and see their costs skyrocket in one way or another. It will create mountains of new paperwork and bureaucratic barriers that are positively meant to kick people off their Medicaid and ACA coverage. And there is new sabotage to the ACA healthcare markets, which will mean more people losing their affordable coverage. Meanwhile, there is nothing, a big fat zero, when it comes to renewing the tax credits Democrats passed to lower your healthcare costs. That's right. While Republicans are showering their billionaire donors in new tax breaks, they will not lift a finger to extend healthcare tax credits that are saving millions of families thousands of dollars a year on health coverage. Instead, they're going to make sure people lose health care coverage, including our seniors, people with disabilities, pregnant women, millions of patients who rely on Medicaid. And let's not forget, the cuts in their bill are going to shutter hospitals across the country, especially in our rural areas. Do you have Medicaid, Medicare, employer-sponsored coverage? Regardless, Republicans have some pretty bad news for you, because it hardly matters what insurance you're on when you don't have a hospital to get care anymore. In Washington State, we have 14 rural hospitals that are fighting to survive and would likely close under this bill, mostly in areas represented by Republicans, I should add. Not to mention, we have 6 rural labor and delivery units that could be forced to close their doors under this bill. And you know what the Senate Republicans did? They made that problem worse. They put even more pressure on our rural hospitals. I'm telling you, this betrayal is getting bigger and uglier by the day. And this cannot get lost. Republicans want to shut the doors of one of the biggest healthcare providers in the country. They want to defund Planned Parenthood. That is wildly harmful and wildly unpopular. It would shutter at least 200 health centers that provide a wide spectrum of care, including cancer screenings, pap smears, birth control for millions of women. And let's not forget, Republicans are cutting nutrition assistance too. This big, ugly betrayal would make one of the biggest cuts to SNAP in history. We are talking around a $200 billion cut over the next 10 years. Now, it should be obvious, but that would be devastating for our country and for our kids' future. And yet, Republicans are not giving up on taking dinner off the table, taking school lunch off kids' trays, all so they can shovel tax cuts at billionaires and wealthy corporations. And it is worth underscoring the new red tape in their bill is even targeted at some of our most vulnerable families, because it expands work requirements to apply to seniors and parents with kids in school. Mr. President, when my dad, World War II veteran, got sick with multiple sclerosis. He lost his job. He lost his job. My mom was at home, 7 kids she was raising. My dad lost his job, and they had to spend, my mom had to spend some time getting some new skills so she could go back to work and take care of our family. You know what, during that time? We had to rely on food stamps in my family to feed those 7 kids in my family. But under this Republican bill today, because neither of my parents had a job during those few months, my family would not be eligible for SNAP benefits. We would not have even gotten food on our table at the worst time in my family's life. This is wrong. Thanks to those food stamps, my family did get through that rough patch. And all 7 of us kids grew up to give back to our communities. Whether it's a firefighter or a middle school teacher, or even here as a United States Senator. So I can't emphasize enough. Republicans want to cut families from SNAP and Medicaid programs that give people a hand up in hard times. Why? So they can give an enormous handout to the richest people and biggest companies in our country. Oh, and at the same time, they're making it harder to afford groceries and health care. I should mention, they are also gutting energy investments in a completely chaotic way that is all but guaranteed to drive away jobs and drive up energy costs for all of American families. And at the same time, in this bill, they're giving billionaires billions of dollars. Republicans are going to give students the short end of the stick. This big mess of a bill would tear away programs and protections that make it possible for many students to pursue a higher education. It eliminates Grad Plus loans. It cuts families off from Parent Plus loans. It punishes students who go into public service or a medical residency, and more. Meanwhile, they are tearing down the guardrails from gutting regulations that protect students whose universities commit fraud, to opening a Pandora's box for Pell Grants with a new loophole that will let low-quality programs suck up our taxpayer dollars. These changes are especially going to hurt students from low-income families and first-generation college students and our veterans. Some of them will have no way to go to college when Republicans take their support away. Some will be driven into predatory private loans they can't afford. And some will get lured into low-quality programs that take their money, waste taxpayer dollars, and leave the student worse off. And if that wasn't enough, if the Secretary of Education wanted to try and stop this kind of fraud and protect students, Republicans will leave them about as much authority as a school hall monitor, because in this bill, Republicans prevent any Secretary of Education from making regulations that carry added benefits for borrowers. And it hardly matters if that is a good impact, like saving students money or protecting taxpayer dollars from fraud or making higher education more accessible. Republicans are going to make problems worse and make fixing them even harder. Students in this country should be outraged. And I want to be perfectly clear about something. If Republicans charge ahead with this big, awful mess, which they seem intent on doing, they can kiss any last shred of credibility goodbye, as we just talked about, when it comes to pretending they care about balancing the budget or addressing the national debt. The idea was already laughable. For the entirety of the 21st century, the biggest driver of the national debt has been tax cuts that Republicans championed. But now, as we just talked about, they want to put at least $4 trillion, that is trillions with a T, on the national credit card. Why? So they can shower the richest people on the planet with more money. And then they're pretending all the math works and it's kind of easy peasy if they can do it if they kick people off health care or take enough meals away from kids or close enough hospitals, or better still, use some absurd accounting gimmick to pretend that billions of dollars in new tax cuts for their billionaire donors actually just don't cost anything. Well, I've got some bad news for Republicans. Your math is terrible, and so's this bill. This thing is very expensive, and you don't have to take my word for it. Ask the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office, which just said the latest version of this bill will add 4 trillion, T-trillion, to the debt with just over the next 10 years. If Republicans want to ignore them, you can also ask the fiscal hawks at the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget. They calculate that the House bill adds $5 trillion to our debt when you include interest payments and the cost of making temporary provisions in this bill permanent. And we are told the Senate bill is even less fiscally responsible. Everyone agrees this thing is not beautiful, but it is recklessly big, and it won't just increase the debt, it will blow it up. Mr. President, this may very well be the most expensive bill in history. I say may because Republicans are still planning changes. We have not yet gotten the final bill. They already cut out even more taxes for multinational corporations. SNAP benefits, they're still on the chopping block. Healthcare, still on the chopping block. In fact, they want to cut Medicaid even more painfully. We may not know how expensive the Republicans will be in the end, but we know who is paying for it. Paying for it is you, working families. And it is important for people to know, as bad as this bill is, Republicans were trying to make it even worse. Now, Democrats have been fighting them every step of the way, and we have notched a few important wins by challenging every single provision we possibly could under the Senate rules. So I want to talk about some of the things Democrats were successful in getting out. Because if Republicans had their way, not only would this bill take away more food from our struggling families or shutter even more hospitals and kick even more people off their health insurance, it would have also sold off all of our public lands. And if instead of just slashing CFPB funding, it would have completely shuttered the doors of a very important federal watchdog that protects Americans from getting scammed. If Republicans had their way, this bill would make it easier to buy gun silencers, harder to get your earned income tax credit or pay off your student loan, and effectively impossible to get insurance plans on the marketplace that cover abortion care. If Republicans had their way, this bill would have also given Trump more power to deny funding to our constituents on a whim and less power for the courts to stop him. We're talking about a whole smorgasbord of really awful, unpopular ideas and policies that would have hurt our families and weakened our democracy. Ideas that were this close to making it into this bill. But Republicans did not have their way. Democrats have been fighting back at every single step. We got those provisions tossed in the shredder, and we are still doing our darndest to send the rest of the bill to the shredder as well. Now, let's be clear. When we talk about how unpopular this bill is with the American people, the reason is simple. This bill polls like garbage because it is garbage. That's why it should go nowhere except a trash bin. Democrats are going to keep pushing back on this monstrosity with absolutely everything we've got at every step we can. We're not going to stand by as Republicans shutter hospitals so the richest people in the country can build another vacation home. We are not going to sit around and let Republicans kick millions of people off of their insurance and raise working families' premiums so corporate executives can get a bigger bonus. And we are not going to be silent as Republicans take food away from struggling families so they can help billionaires fuel up their private jets. We're going to keep speaking up. We're going to keep pushing back, and we're going to make sure everyone knows exactly what is going on here. This bill is deeply unpopular, that much is clear, but if Republicans keep pushing for this disaster, buckle up, because we are only going to keep getting louder and louder about how big this is, how ugly it is, And it is only going to get more unpopular with the folks back home as these provisions are enacted if this bill passes. I'm pretty astounded by how far some Republicans are trying to stick their heads in the sand on this. One Republican senator told their concerned constituents, and I quote, "We're all going to die." Well, maybe that's a better name for the bill. At least it's more honest. Because when you take health care away from people, when you make it harder to get, when you make it harder to afford, when you close the only hospital for miles, yeah, you're right, people will die. You'd think my colleagues would show a bit more concern about that. Instead, that senator actually doubled down, and in a response video, she filmed walking through a cemetery. I don't know how you get out of touch that much to misunderstand this, but let me be clear about something to our Republicans. Whistling past the graveyard is a metaphor to stop ignoring dangers. It is not a literal messaging suggestion. And if you thought Republicans couldn't be any more dismissive to their own constituents, this week another Republican senator who was speaking about people voicing their concerns about these Medicaid cuts that said they will, quote, "people will get over it." Mr. President, I have news for every one of my Republican colleagues who is trying to deny the reality of this bill and pretend the fairy tales they are telling themselves are true. When someone's local hospital closes, they don't get over it. When someone's kid is kicked off health care, they do not get over it. And if Republicans don't want to take my word for it, they can listen to the doctor I spoke with who warned when patients go uninsured, they delay care and it increases costs for everyone. Instead of paying $10 for diabetic medication, we'll pay $10,000 for an amputation. Or Republicans can actually read the countless letters I'm getting from my constituents, sharing their stories. Quote, "My dad is a double amputee. He relies on Medicaid. Without Medicaid, we couldn't get my kids anti-seizure medication." Or I'm a full-time caregiver for my daughter with cerebral palsy, or my son with spina bifida, or my elderly mother, and this bill threatens to kick them off their health care and the support services they rely on to survive. Or better yet, Republicans can go out and talk to their own constituents, because I have no doubt they will hear similar stories. They will even come to you. Advocates have been here in DC all week. I've seen them in the halls. I've heard them from my office. And now Republicans can listen to the people across the country who are warning them about this bill, and they can do the right thing and abandon this effort. Or they can keep ignoring them, but make no mistake, in the end, the American people will have their voices and their votes heard. Because at the end of the day, this bill, this monstrosity of a bill, is all in the goal of a tax break for multi-billionaires and corporations, and the way they pay for it is by taking away your health care and your nutrition, the things your family or your neighbors or people you know rely on. And that's just wrong. It's un-American, and we're fighting back. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Rhode Island.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I rise today to oppose this partisan reconciliation bill. Republicans have named it the One Big Beautiful Bill, but you'd only use that kind of title if you were trying to hide something. And here's the simple truth. This bill takes health insurance and food assistance away from millions of Americans and gives President Trump's billionaire and millionaire friends giant tax cuts. And this bill, it would provide hundreds of billions of dollars in tax giveaways to the country's 902 billionaires and millionaires, while kicking 17 million Americans off their health insurance. Just weigh the balance. 902 beneficiaries with extraordinary tax deductions and tax benefits versus denial of health care to 17 million Americans. It doesn't balance. And despite slashing health care, somehow this bill will add trillions of dollars to our national debt. It will further weaken our financial position in the world. It will indeed have many countries wondering if the United States is, as it has been since the end of World War II, the place to put their resources, their investments, their reserves. This could have profound fiscal and monetary implications for the United States. And if you tie that together with this tariff battle, we are headed economically in the wrong direction as we are socially. This bill is loaded with outrageous special interest giveaways and President Trump's personal political priorities. For example, $7.5 billion for wealthy developers to use for luxury housing and other high-priced developments at a time when affordable housing for working families is a crisis in every state in the country. $1.7 billion for gun makers who will be able to sell silencers, sawed-off shotguns, short-barrel rifles, and other very dangerous weapons and components tax-free, making our streets more dangerous for police and for the American people, and indeed, especially for the police, because they're the first responders. They're the ones that are typically going to the door wondering if the person behind that door has an automatic weapon or some other weapon designed not to hunt or shoot, but to kill. Hundreds of millions of dollars in new tax cuts for extraordinarily wealthy oil and gas companies, and $40 million for a Garden of Heroes, a sculpture garden to honor President Trump's favorite historical personalities. And at the same time, it slashes the budget for the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, which makes sure that shady payday lenders, mortgage lenders, and banks don't fleece American families. And in particular, the military division of the CFPB protects men and women in the uniform of the United States. We were able to pass an interest cap of 36% for active duty personnel. And that is going to be ignored because there's no one to enforce it. And we are going to see, as we have in the past, our soldiers, sailors, airmen, guardians exploited, systematically exploited by all those little automobile shops and payday lenders and everything else that surrounds every military fort base in this country. It's a tale as old as time. My Republican colleagues showering the rich with tax benefits and prioritizing favored industries and friends. President Bush joined with the Republican Congress to do that. Of course, I opposed it. And well, by the way, when President Bush did that, we were projected to have, over the next 10 years, a multi-trillion-dollar surplus. Of course, this legislation will lead us to a multi-trillion-dollar deficit. And it's interesting because when I was younger, the Republicans all associated themselves with fiscal responsibility, balanced budgets, surpluses. That's not the case. President Trump exacerbated the situation in his first term by his grand giveaway. But this time, President Trump and my colleagues on the other side of the aisle are depriving millions of Americans of their health care coverage to pay for it. They are intent on punishing the most vulnerable Americans in this bill, simply for the crime of being poor. In fact, in many cases, despite working very long hours and being poor. I came here to Congress, to the Senate, after serving my country in the U.S. Army, as the President did with great distinction in the United States Navy as a Navy SEAL. I came here to serve my constituents and improve the lives of average Americans. And I think most of my colleagues, Democrats and Republicans alike, came with the same goal. And according to press reports, a few of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle are starting to realize that this bill is going to do great damage to their constituents. One Republican colleague has warned that this bill could leave 600,000 of his constituents without health care coverage and blow a $38 billion hole in his state's budget. That would be a devastating effect. One of the other aspects of this attack on our health care system is there's some people that believe, well, Medicaid doesn't touch me. It certainly does. Because when you extract that much money from the health care system, what will private health insurance do? They'll raise their rates. Everyone will be paying more. And some won't be able to afford it. They'll have to go without coverage. And that is going to be a tragedy for this country. Now, knowing the damage this bill is going to do, one must ask, why would anyone support this? But this legislation is more than just numbers. I've heard from countless Rhode Islanders who are concerned about these cuts during meetings, in letters, when I bump into them at the grocery store or the pharmacy. They've been telling me about how Medicaid has helped them and their families. I've been meeting, for example, with Christina from Smithfield, Rhode Island, for many years. Her daughter, Lauren, was born with cystic fibrosis and has endured countless hospitalizations, procedures, medications, and other challenges as she navigates life with this disease. Christina, Lauren, and their family have private insurance, but Medicaid also helps cover the expenses not covered by private insurance for people with serious illnesses who are not able to work. When President Trump and congressional Republicans began proposing these cuts to Medicaid, Christina told me, and I quote, "Lauren was born with CF, a rare genetic progressive disease which affects her lungs, GI, and endocrine systems. I had no idea we carried this gene. When Lauren was born, she spent a month in the hospital. We almost lost her. When she was 5, she contracted a germ that put her in the hospital for a month and almost killed her. Her lung function fell to 70%. At 13, I thought she was going to die. Her hospital stays were every 3 months for 2 weeks with IV treatments. Her lung function fell to 30%. With one of the medicines for CF, she was able to finally get her lung function back to 65% at 23 years old. She still suffers every day. Just trying to breathe is difficult. If she catches the common cold, it could put her in the hospital. She has had a hard time keeping weight on, and her GI is a disaster. She spent hours in the bathroom. She developed CF-related diabetes, which always puts her in danger. Every day is rigorous treatments and medications just to stay alive. It is with the help of the NIH and the FDA that she is still alive. Please do not make these cuts. If Medicaid is cut, when she is 26, 2 years from now, she will have no way to pay for all of her hospitalizations, medications, and treatments. Few could afford to keep her alive. It is this simple. Without Medicaid, she will die. We need your help. Carolina from Central Falls, Rhode Island, shared similar concerns for her daughter. My daughter has special needs, and we rely on Medicaid for her needs. Not having Medicaid would create a sinkhole for us. People with profound autism need lifetime, 24/7 care. As you consider budget cuts, it is important to me, as your constituent, that you work to ensure that this vulnerable population has access to the critical supports that it needs to survive. I will be looking to you for your courage and leadership. Indeed, and now we're looking across the aisle for courage and leadership to reject this flawed bill. I received an email from one constituent, Wally, in Cranston, Rhode Island. She is a 71-year-old retiree on Medicare. Her husband is 72 with Alzheimer's disease, living in a nursing home under hospice care and relying on Medicaid for his health care. She wrote to me that she was, quote, terrified at all the cuts to programs and services that she and her husband so desperately rely on. Without Medicaid, she wonders if she or her husband would be able to continue receiving care. I also heard from Diane in Coventry, Rhode Island, whose daughter gets life-saving care through Medicaid. Diane said, Medicaid is important to me personally. Medicaid matters to me and my family. My 15-year-old daughter suffered a brain bleed and a stroke at the age of 5. It came out of nowhere and was very unexpected. She has spent a lot of time in the hospital, rehabilitation services, doctor's offices, appointments, etc. over the past almost 10 years. Medicaid allows her to be home and taken care of on a daily basis. Without Medicaid, she would not be able to receive hospital-level care at home. She wouldn't have a wheelchair or any other durable medical equipment. She wouldn't be able to get her life-saving medications or the nourishment she needs through her G-tube. Please, I urge you to save Medicaid, not only for my family, but for millions of others. All of our lives depend on it. Now, my colleagues on the other side of the aisle may say, we're not going to cut these people's Medicaid. We're just going after the fraudsters, the freeloaders who aren't working. Now, who exactly are these fraudsters and freeloaders? Is it the elderly patient who needs expensive nursing home care? Is it the child with a serious chronic health condition? Should we cut off these people's access to health care because they can't work? They physically cannot work? Or because the constant paperwork requirements got lost in the shuffle? Let's be clear. If my colleagues were serious about eliminating fraud, they would be providing states with more resources to investigate questionable claims and bad actors. Medicaid coverage is not extravagant, it is a lifeline. If my colleagues were sincere in their claim that these cuts are about protecting the program, quote, for the people who need it the most, as the majority leader has claimed, then they would be investing the so-called savings back into Medicaid instead of blowing it on tax cuts for the well-off. Instead, this bill is cutting funding to states for Medicaid, and states will have no choice but to pick and choose who will get access to care. But don't take my word for it. The Nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office, CBO, estimates that this bill will cause nearly 17 million Americans to lose their health insurance. 17 million people. That's not fraud. It's just making it harder for people to get health care. On top of that, even if you're one of the lucky ones who gets to keep your Medicaid, will you still be able to get it? Nursing homes rely on Medicaid. More than 6 in 10 nursing home residents in Rhode Island are on Medicaid. As Medicaid funding is cut, what will nursing homes do? I imagine some will have to close their doors or dramatically reduce the number of beds. So you could be one of these fairly well-to-do Rhode Islanders trying to get mom in the Medicaid home, the nursing home, I should say, and you're willing to pay, but if it's closed or there's only 5 beds where there used to be 20, she's going to be where, in my generation, grandparents were, in the living room, in a hospital bed, being cared for, in those days, typically by your mother. So this approach to Medicaid is going to touch every aspect of American life. And the same can be said about the community health care centers. Medicaid makes up a huge portion of the operating budget for community health centers, which provide primary, dental, and behavioral care to more than 200,000 Rhode Islanders. That's roughly 1 in 5 Rhode Islanders. It's hard enough to find a doctor now. It will only get harder if a community health center closes its doors and thousands of patients don't have a doctor anymore. And where do all those patients end up when they can't get routine care? The emergency room. That means there will be lines out the door, and if you have a serious health event and need to get in, you better get used to waiting a long time. This is not how a health system is supposed to run. And in Rhode Island, our health system is already on the brink. People are just getting by. People are waiting in the hallways of ERs for a bed upstairs. People are spending days on the phone trying to find a doctor. We should be making these things better, not worse. But again, Republicans' main priority seems not the physical or financial health of everyday Americans. It is providing massive tax cuts to President Trump's billionaire and millionaire friends. There's certainly nothing wrong with being successful, and there's nothing wrong with wealth. That's something that has been part of the American dream since our beginning. But what it requires is opportunity. And one of the fundamental opportunities it requires is good health and good education. And what this bill will do is destroy our healthcare system and force the states to make dramatic cuts to the education system. We are shutting down opportunity in America while we enrich the wealthy elite. The American dream, as I believe it, is about the middle class and a government that's focused on them, not taking $1 trillion from Medicaid so Republicans can gift to those who've already benefited from many other gifts. Mr. President, let's put the enormity of this transfer to the wealthiest in perspective. There are about 128 million households in America. Yet somehow this bill gives the top 0.1% of households a $250,000 tax cut, a giveaway that's over 3 times larger than what the median American household makes in a year. When confronted with this point, Republicans consistently try to hide the ball. Middle and working class Americans are getting tax cuts too, they say. Who cares if the rich gets richer? Well, the Senate bill raises taxes on the lowest income Americans, the same families from whom Republicans are ripping away health care and other benefits. While we are voting on this bill without a full analysis of its impact on households, the Congressional Budget Office found that the House-passed version would take around $1,600 away from these lowest income households each year after accounting for tax changes and benefit cuts. And it's not just low-income Americans. Researchers at Penn's Wharton School of Business have found that most Americans lose money under the House bill in future years, too. I want to be crystal clear. We need to reform our tax care system. We need to make it fairer for working Americans, not just for the ultra-wealthy. We hear from people so often that government is broken. They're right. Our tax system is unfair and needs reform. But giving the top 1/10 of 1% of Americans an extra $250,000 every year is not fixing the government. It's just adding to the sense of unfairness and brokenness that so many citizens feel. We can do a bipartisan tax bill that is both fully paid for and that helps average Americans. In fact, we almost did that last summer when the House passed a tax bill 357 to 70 that would have extended the child tax credit and reinstated tax cuts for businesses without increasing the deficit. 48 bipartisan senators voted for that bill in this very chamber, but it was blocked because Republican leaders wanted to pass something like this bill before us today. My Republican colleagues have drafted a bill that is neither paid for nor helps most Americans. Worst of all, they have chosen to take from the poor and the middle class and the working class to give to billionaires. This bill is very bad policy. It's almost un-American if you believe that the essence of America, as expressed by one of our greatest presidents, Abraham Lincoln, was to give every person a fair chance in the race of life. This bill denies that chance to millions and millions of Americans while enhancing and filling the pockets of the wealthiest. And I oppose it. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Good.
Thank you. I'm honored to follow my colleague, Senator Reid, and he is absolutely right that this bill